You've read roughly the first half of Matthew for today's lesson, and I want to cover quite a few points today, so I'm glad you have that under your belt. As we mentioned before, the audience Matthew had in mind when he composed his gospel was Jewish. So he emphasizes Jesus in a Jewish context. Jesus is the heir to David's throne. As we saw, he's attended by kings and threatens a king even in his very earliest weeks. And then Jesus is seen as fulfilling Hebrew scripture, either via fulfillment, and we looked at a number of fulfillment citations, or typology, which we'll talk about today. We can also see Matthew's interest in a Jewish audience by the way he gives less attention to non-Jewish characters in stories. Remember the demoniac whose demons went into the herd of swine. In both Mark and Luke, the detail is mentioned of him wanting to go with Jesus, but Matthew leaves that out. In Matthew chapter 10, where the disciples are given their instructions before leaving on a preaching tour, they are told to go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And in Luke and Mark, the parallel passages don't have this detail. When we look at Matthew as a whole, we can see that Mark is used as an outline or basis for his gospel, but individual episodes that appear in Mark are trimmed in Matthew. And as we saw in the last lesson, the demoniac's behavior is described in less detail in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 9, you read the story of Jesus healing a paralyzed man. In Mark and Luke, in the parallel passages, this paralyzed man is lowered through the roof into a home where Jesus was. And in Matthew, that detail is trimmed out. Another thing that you see in the structure of Matthew is that there are 5 discourses, 5 passages of lecture that Jesus is giving. One of these is the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And then Jesus commissions the apostles as they go out in chapter 10. There is a chapter of parables in chapter 13, and then Jesus lectures on the topic, the kingdom of God, in chapter 18. And then chapters 23 through 25 have woes pronounced on the scribes and Pharisees, eschatological discourses. Eschatology refers to the end times, and more parables. Of course, there are many miracles in all of the Gospels, and we'll talk about the way these miracles are used when we get to the book of John. But I want to say very briefly that the miracles are a way of exercising compassion. In the book of Matthew, Jesus is mentioned as having compassion. People ask him for help and he helps them. They're a means of establishing his identity as a prophet, as a representative for God. The people, when he performs his miracles, say to each other, "Could this be the Messiah, the anointed, the heir of David?" The Pharisees ask him for a miracle when they ask him for a sign to establish his identity. The imprisoned John sends his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one we were waiting for? Are you the Messiah? Are you the anointed heir of David, or should we look for someone else? And Jesus responds to John's disciples by saying, well, look at the miracles. The blind see, the lame walk, etc. So they are not only a way to exercise compassion, but also a way to establish identity. And these miracles include healing of people who are sick or paralyzed, as well as, on a couple of occasions, people who are already dead. Casting out demons, as we looked at in the previous lesson, but also many other instances. Jesus provides food in the wilderness, and he exercises his dominance over nature in a couple of lake miracles where he calms the storm or walks on water. And these are supposed to remind you of Moses, for example, with his signs to show Pharaoh, with the plagues. And even though it wasn't Moses providing the food in the wilderness, the provision of bread in the wilderness is supposed to remind you of Moses' time. We're also supposed to be reminded of Elijah and Elisha, who raised the dead and under whose auspices God provided food for the people that were in need. Now, I want to spend quite a bit of today's lesson talking about the difference between fulfillment and typology, because fulfillment and typology are both very important themes for the book of Matthew. Fulfillment relies on a passage of the Hebrew Bible which is regarded as a verbal prediction. So in many cases, the Hebrew Bible passage referred to has its own context. So it had a relevance in the contemporaneous circumstances in the Hebrew Bible, but that isn't part of what is referred to in Matthew. The passage is kind of trimmed of its context and referred to as a prediction. An example is in Isaiah chapter 7, when Isaiah is offering God's word to King Ahaz and assuring him of his blessing. And the sign is in verse 14, a young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. This was explicitly directed to King Ahaz and linked to the message that Isaiah is giving him in this particular passage. But when Matthew quotes it, he is treating it as a prediction of several hundred years later, that Jesus is going to be born to a young woman. Now, the reference in Matthew is to the Greek wording of the Septuagint. So the word for young woman is explicitly virgin in the Septuagint, whereas in the Hebrew, it could be a virgin, it could be a young married woman. The point is the young woman's age and not her sexual experience or lack thereof. My point is that in Matthew 1, Matthew is treating Isaiah 7 as a verbal prediction that Jesus can fulfill by trimming it of its original context in the book of Isaiah. Typology is different. Jesus' life fulfills some kind of event. The idea of typology reflects back to an event rather than a verbal prediction. Some event in the past foreshadows an event in Jesus' life. Take a look at Hosea chapter 11. This is a poetic passage When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So in this poetic passage, the whole nation of Israel is personified as God's child that he calls out of Egypt away from Pharaoh. It's a poetic reference to the Exodus. Now in Matthew chapter 2, Matthew applies this to Jesus's parents taking him from Bethlehem to Egypt so that he wouldn't be in danger when Herod had the baby boys slaughtered, rather than have one of them grow up to be a claimant to the throne, competition for him. So in chapter 2, verse 15, says, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son." You could say this is trimmed of all context. This is treated without reference to an event. You could call this a verbal prediction. On the other hand, you could look at this as typology, and you could say, Jesus is God's son, called out of Egypt, just as the whole nation of Israel was called out of Egypt. Herod's death, the family returns to Israel, to Nazareth. You could say, using the language of typology, Israel is a type or a shadow of Jesus. Jesus is the reality in the language of typology. You could say is the Israelites' departure from Egypt typifies Jesus' family's departure from Egypt. Or you could say the Israelites' departure from Egypt is a type. It foreshadows Jesus' family's departure from Egypt. You could even say Pharaoh's death in the Red Sea typifies Herod's death, so that Israel is able to leave Egypt and Jesus is able to leave Egypt. This is not unique to Matthew. I'm just introducing the idea of typology with Matthew because he really uses it a lot. But John uses it as well. So turn to the book of John, chapter 1. You've already read this a couple of lessons back, the beginning of John's Gospel. So John chapter 1, verse 29, the next day John the Baptist saw Jesus coming toward him and declared, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And this is a reference to Genesis chapter 22, verse 8, where Isaac was about to be a burnt offering. You could say Jesus' death or Jesus' sacrifice is typified by all the burnt offerings in the Hebrew Bible. You could say specifically with relation to Abraham that when Abraham said to Isaac, God himself will provide a lamb. So God provides the sacrificial offering. Jesus is called the Lamb of God by John. So when you talk about this, you could say the burnt offerings typify Jesus' death on the cross, or you could say the ram in Genesis 22 is a type of Jesus. So I have a challenge for you. This relates to part of your reading for today, Matthew chapter 12. You've got the scribes and the Pharisees asking Jesus for a sign, and Jesus says, no sign will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Verse 40, for just as Jonah was 3 days and nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. put Jesus and Jonah together in a sentence, use the noun type or the verb typify, or use the verb prefigures or the verb foreshadows in your sentence. And I want you to actually stop the video lecture while you do this, and then you can check your examples against the ones on the lecture notes, page 3. Okay, how did you do? Did you get anywhere close to the target with that? I'm going to give you some more opportunities to practice in the next lesson. And I warn you that the whole essay for this last third of the class will give you an opportunity to prove that you understand typology and fulfillment. Another motif that you find in the Gospel of Matthew is excess. So in chapter 5, there's an invitation for Jesus's listeners to be excessive in their righteousness. Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the most religious people of his generation, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on with several examples of excessive righteousness. Killing is equated to anger or insult, and then adultery is equated to fantasizing about someone that you're not married to. Another motif here is an inversion of the Deuteronomic formula. Also in Matthew 5, Jesus is saying that the people that are hungry, the people that are thirsty, the people that are poor are the ones that are blessed, rather than the ones that have all the good things. Now, in Matthew, this is spiritualized, but in the parallel passage in the book of Luke, it's just people who are poor, not people who are poor in spirit. It's just people who are hungering and thirsting, not necessarily hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Inversion of the Deuteronomic formula, the idea that the good enjoy lots of physical, worldly blessings, is inverted by just the whole structure of all of the Gospels, because you have God's obedient Son tortured to death, which is not exactly a fulfillment of all the blessings in the book of Deuteronomy. I want you to notice the parables in Matthew, and we'll look at some more of these in the next lesson. But the parable is Jesus's favorite literary form. Whereas many of the prophets delivered their messages in poetry, Jesus is much more likely to deliver them in parables. Now, the parable is also a prophetic form that we saw occasionally in the Hebrew Bible. You'd have these little metaphorical messages that the prophets would either act out or sometimes deliver as a message. We'll see when we move into the next lesson that Jesus actually retells as a parable one of the parables in the book of Isaiah. And I want to close by noting something that I drew your attention to in the preceding lesson. The motif of doubling shows up in Matthew more than once. So the Gadarene demoniacs, there were 2 of them in the lesson that you looked at last time. Whereas Mark had 1 and Luke had 1, Matthew has 2. The same story is told of blind beggars asking Jesus to help them see. In the parallel passages in Mark 10 and Luke 18, there's just one beggar. In fact, Mark actually gives him a name. And then at the end of Jesus's mission, when he rides a donkey into Jerusalem, all four of the Gospels include this episode of him riding a donkey into Jerusalem. Matthew uses a fulfillment citation to introduce it, and he quotes Zechariah 9, verse 9. This is a poetic passage, and you see the parallelism. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, what's being emphasized in the original poetic version is how humble this king is. He's not riding a war horse the way you might expect a triumphant, victorious king to be. He's riding a donkey, a much less expensive animal. And it's such a much less expensive animal that it gets more intense to be a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, in Zechariah, of course, it's poetry. You're not supposed to be considering a whole herd of donkeys, first a donkey, then a colt, then a foal of a donkey. It's three different ways to name an animal that emphasizes the king's humility. And in John, Luke, and Mark, it's a young donkey, one that hasn't been ridden yet. And let's look in Matthew chapter 21. In verse 2, Jesus says, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me." Then the fulfillment citation. This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. "Look, your king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of the donkey." So the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. So the doubling is carried to the extent that Jesus is sitting on two animals at once. So this is a fulfillment, but you might think, well, Matthew is being rather literal-minded here when it comes to noticing the poetic parallelism and the way it works in Zechariah 9.